Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Astra Academy. My name is Dr. John Barnshaw. I'm the Associate Vice President for Research and Statistics at Ad Astra. And joining me today is Ken Redd, the Senior Director for Research and Policy Analysis at NACUBO, the National Association of College and University Business Officers. And joining me as well is Stefan Gray. Stefan is the Assistant Director of Research and Policy Analysis at NACUBO, and we'll be discussing the recently released NACUBO tuition discounting study. So I look forward to a very exciting and robust conversation over the course of the hour. A little bit about the formatting. You can advance to the next slide, please. Following a brief introduction about Ad Astra, we're going to turn it over to Ken and Stefan as they share with you from the NACUBO tuition discounting study. And then we'll take your comments or questions and provide a little bit of additional information about the study and survey if you have any additional questions during the time. Next slide. So a little bit about Ad Astra. For those of you that might be joining that saw our posts on social media, or maybe you saw posts from colleagues who posted or joined the meeting, Ad Astra is a course scheduling and enrollment management organization. We work with over 500 institutions of higher education annually, and our focus is on scheduling and improving accessibility in scheduling for students. We offer some unique solutions that are designed to graduate and retain more students faster. In addition to those resources, we also have Astra Academy, which is a free webinar series that brings together diverse stakeholders across the higher education landscape to share with their insights and how they're working to improve student outcomes, generally with a focus on student retention, time to completion, and graduation. Today, we are having Ken and Stefan join us as part of NACUBO and the tuition discounting study, because many of you over the course of the last year or two have reached out to me and have asked the question, well, why does tuition keep rising, and what can we do about it? And generally, many of us can focus on retention, time to completion, graduation, but the question still remains, why do institutions have rising tuition? And another question that's somewhat related and very important is, how much does tuition discounting actually occur? So I thought it would make a lot of sense for our audience to bring in the two leading experts in higher education in this area, Ken and Stefan. So I'm very pleased to introduce them to you, and I will turn it over to Ken. Ken?
John, thanks for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. We at NACUBO have been studying tuition discounting since about 1994. We've done this annual survey. We actually took the survey over from another group that had started it, and we took it national and continued it for at least the years since 1994. So very pleased to share our expertise with you in this area. The NACUBO tuition discounting study, right now we include just the private nonprofit four-year institutions that were members of NACUBO as of the fall of the study year, which for this year, fall of 2018. We had a little bit more than 800 institutions that were invited to participate. We had roughly 400 institutions, 405 to be exact, participate. And those institutions range in size and research complexity from schools at the high-end research universities down to small private colleges. All were members of NACUBO, as I mentioned, as of September of 2018. As John mentioned, the study has a lot of implications on institutional financial structures and on financial aid for students. We will get into those as we go through. The results But I just wanted to add that the one thing that we are particularly gratified is the amount of attention that the study has gotten this year has been bigger probably than any year that I can remember being at NACUBO. And I think part of that is sort of what John was leading up to, and that is the concern that institutions and the general public and many policy experts and researchers have on what not only is the impact of this on families and students, but what's the impact on institutions and their finances. As many of you know, as private institutions, the schools that we study are very, usually very dependent on their tuition revenue. So the more discounting that occurs, the more it potentially leads to financial stress for the schools. So just keeping that in mind, I will turn it over to my colleague, Stefan Gray, who will walk through the results based on some key questions that we get asked and that Ad Astra and John and his colleagues have asked us to address. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Stefan Gray.
Thank you, Ken, and welcome everyone to our presentation today about the tuition discounting study results. As Ken mentioned, we had about 405 institutions participate in the study this year, about one institution over last year's study, so we had 404 institutions participate last year. So having a really good repeat participation has allowed us to do a lot of really good things as it relates to data analysis and such. So part of our, it's not pictured on this slide, I'll just get into the respondents from last year. NACUBO breaks down our constituent groups into 4 categories, one being research institutions, other being comprehensive institutions, small institutions, and community colleges. We do not, in the tuition discounting study, include community colleges in this particular study. So the breakdown for our research institutions, we had about 37 participate. In our comprehensive institutions, we had 54. And in our small institutions, so your small, mostly baccalaureate colleges, we had 314 institutions participate in the study. So one of the key features about higher education as an industry is that college and universities, as we all know, have the ability to price, to provide discounts on tuition or to price discriminate. So in essence, many students who attend the same university will likely not pay the same tuition price to attend due to discounting practices and strategies, as well as other sources of financial aid. So the rate at which institutions provide discounts and the reasons that they provide discounts vary across institutions. So it can vary by research institutions, comprehensive doctoral institutions, as well as small institutions, because these institutions, as we all know, have different missions, different initiatives, different sizes. They have different financial help and are in different regions of the country. However, one thing that we've learned over the length of this study is that generally discounting practices are often used to attract or to retain students who are unable or unwilling to pay the full tuition and fee sticker price. So at NACUBO, the average institutional discount rate is defined as institutional grant dollars as a % of gross tuition and fee revenue. And as you can see illustrated in this slide, discount rates have continued to increase, with the average discount rate for first-time freshmen reaching 50.5% in the 17-18 academic year, and is estimated to be 52.2% in the 2018-19 academic year. And additionally, we see tuition discount rates for all undergraduates reach 44.6% in 17-18, and it's estimated to be 43.3% in 18-19. So what does this mean? The National Center for Education Statistics show that tuition and fee revenue, as Ken mentioned, represents a pretty decent proportion of overall tuition revenue at private nonprofit colleges and universities. In 2016-17, it represented about 30%, and this is across all of the private nonprofit institutions in the United States. So I don't imagine that proportion changed dramatically in 1 year or 1 or 2 years. But it's important to note that tuition revenue represents a large share of revenue for these institutions. And depending on the institution size, mission, Carnegie classification, this can mean that through their discounting strategies that they may be foregoing a large share of tuition revenue to provide access to students and or to compete for other students. It can be a huge sacrifice for some institutions. However, meeting their enrollment goals and fulfilling their missions is paramount. So one of the many features that this does, tuition discounting does for students, as you can see here, is what impact does discounting have on students attending these colleges? In the grand scheme of things, it's a really good thing. As you can see illustrated here in this slide, it shows that almost 9 out of 10 first-time freshmen receive some form of institutional aid, which is really good for students. And as we know, and research has showed that students are typically, especially those from low-income background, first-generation students, are typically price sensitive. So when they see the sticker price of an institution being somewhat outside of their realm of affordability, they opt to not apply to those institutions. But this is good news to know that 9 out of 10 students who are admitted to many of the institutions in this study receive some form of financial aid. Also, it's important to note that our student discount rate, so from the student perspective, we calculate a student discount rate, and it's defined as the average grant amount as a share of average tuition and fees. So from the student perspective, this means that in 2017-18, 52.2% of the tuition and fee sticker price was covered by the institutional grant that those students received. And in 2018-19, it's estimated that 58.9% of the aid that was received will cover tuition and fee sticker price. So this has really good implications for students who are thinking about schools that may be outside of their realm of affordability. It also has really good implications for as we think about what students are awarded aid and how much that aid might be. But it also provides some explanation on why discount rates have perhaps continue to increase, because we have more students receiving institutional financial aid, which is also a really good thing for students. However, on the institutional finance side, it may not be as great of a story, but it also, as I mentioned previously, depends on the institution. So from an institutional perspective, higher discount rates may not necessarily be a great thing. As illustrated here, discount rates have led to much slower growth in tuition revenue. This graph is in current dollars, not adjusted for inflation, but it's evident that year-to-year changes in net tuition revenue has been volatile over the last 10 years. On average, institutions saw a 0.8% decline in net tuition revenue from their first-time full-time freshmen in 2017-18. And after adjusting for inflation, which we use HEPI, inflation was estimated about 2.8% by HEPI. This equates to about 3.6% drop in net tuition revenue. And although not shown here, also net tuition revenue for all undergraduates was flat in 2017-18, and is expected only to rise to 1.6%. And this is not adjusting for inflation. And as I discussed in the first slide, tuition and fees represents a pretty large share of overall tuition, overall revenue at private nonprofit institutions. This means that institutions are in some cases losing revenue in the context where costs continue to rise. And as John, when John started us off, we talked about why tuition prices continue to rise. Well, part of that reason is because costs continue to rise, and net tuition revenue continues to remain flat because institutions are faced with many different challenges around their finances. When it comes to changing demographics of students, it comes to having to pay for the deferred maintenance that continues to occur in these institutions. Many of them are very old. It requires a lot of upkeep. So part of that, in calculating tuition prices, these things are taken into account. In recent years, we've experienced a number of mergers and closures among small schools with dwindling enrollments due to a number of factors, but one of them being associated with losses in tuition revenue. And part of the challenge, too, is the fact that institutions of higher education are facing declining student enrollment. So among the many things that tuition discounts are used for, institutional financial aid strategies, it's used to really for institutions to meet their enrollment goals. So for some institutions who may not be as selective, we have pretty generally standard admission rates and considerations. It's helpful that students are able to be tapped into to know that that financial aid is available for these students in these institutions to ensure that they are able to meet their enrollment goals over time. Another issue, and this has impact on net tuition revenues, regarding dedicated sources for funding institutional financial aid. So in essence, we talk about tuition discounts in two categories: one that is funded and and the other that is unfunded. The funded financial aid, and we asked this question also in our survey, is around institutional financial aid that is funded by endowment resources. And the responses range, as you imagine, across institutions by their size and how large their endowments might be. I think on average, we showed that 11% of our respondents, 11% of financial aid was funded by institutional endowments. And this has implications on, so 11%, if you think about a funded dedicated source for providing financial aid versus the other percentage of that, which would be unfunded and comes from tuition revenue. So essentially, to provide those discounts, institutions are foregoing that tuition revenue, which of course has implications on net tuition revenue. So as we think about what institutions are doing to make up for the shortfall in net tuition revenue specifically, we asked a question in the survey to gauge how institutions are overcoming these downfalls in institutional financial aid. So the top three strategies cited in the study have been student recruitment, student retention, and financial aid. So 75.7%, 69.3%, and 65.6% respectively. And we see that as it relates to student recruitment strategies, institutions have done more to identify and recruit in areas that they may not have focused on in the past. So as we know, in higher education, there has been a significant increase in adult learners, and especially those students who are non-traditionally aged, 25 and up. So institutions are, in the study and outwardly, are looking to recruit in areas where they hadn't before, not only geographically, but also maybe within their own periphery, vicinity in the institution, but just a different demographic of students, and making their programs more accessible for that student population to ensure that they can meet their enrollment goals. On the retention side, institutions in some ways have considered, like private sector businesses, to see students almost as customers. So by operating under the notion that of repeat buyers, for instance, if you provide students with a really good experience and a place where they can learn, grow, and retain information and become successful and have perhaps some really good outcomes after their time at the institution, there is a higher chance for those students to re-enroll. So institutions have done a lot more on the re-enrollment effort in the spring semester, especially to make sure that they have these quote-unquote repeat buyers that will allow them to free up some resources that maybe on the recruitment and admissions side, which we know can be very, very expensive. Recruiting and admissions can be very expensive, just because thinking about these institutions who do not always have to deal with students being place bound, because they have the abilities in some ways to recruit in areas outside of their state and local areas. On the financial aid side, we know that institutions have continued to try and increase their net tuition revenue and have packaged their aid differently. Some have attempted to get their discount rates under control by internally rethinking how much aid should be distributed and to whom it should be awarded. We found that some institutions have restructured a bit to work differently, where enrollment management offices have come about, as well as where you might have financial aid in one division and admissions in another, combining those functions to make sure that there's seamless communication with financial aid and admissions to know that how aid is being packaged and to whom it's being awarded and how much. On the lower end, institutions have cited academic programs, facilities, and tuition pricing strategies as other ways that they have attempted to increase net revenue. So academic programs have spanned to make program offerings more accessible for students, especially those who may work full-time or may not have the ability as traditionally aged 18 to 24-year-old students to attend classes during the day. On the facility side, it's always been a common notion that facilities and amenities helps to attract students, which also drives up costs, which also has implications, as we all know, on tuition price. And tuition pricing strategies has been another way that institutions have attempted to increase net revenue. So we've noticed sometimes in the comments, because we allow institutions to provide some comments on how their these strategies are working. And some have done tuition resets. Some have also tried to lower tuition, because that also has implications on how many students might attend. It might increase enrollment over time. So many different ways. It's really good to learn that institutions are trying really hard to fulfill their missions. Another strategy which was really interesting in this part was the fact that 7.7% of institutions reported that they didn't really change much of their strategies, reported no new strategies, but were continuing. We found that on the research side, so the research institutions overwhelmingly reported that they didn't try or implement any new strategies, which, considering their size, they may not have to, because most of the pressures that we find across the study, especially because we had 314 small institutions report data, is that our smaller institutions are having more issues when it comes to enrollment challenges and net tuition revenue. Over time, so as it relates to what this means, so in the context of net tuition revenue and tuition discounting and what it means for institutions in the future, I think the best response is we don't know, and only time will tell. As we mentioned in the study, each year tuition discounts have reached an all-time high. So this year we exceeded 50% on the first-time full-time freshman discount rate for 2017-18, although it was estimated last year that we'll get really close to it. But we don't know, is that a bad thing? For some institutions, we know that it has been, and the decline in net tuition revenue has resulted in some institutions having to close their doors or merge with other institutions. But on the other end, there have been a number of institutions that have done well despite the growing tuition discount rates. So at this time, I guess it's safe to say that we don't know, but this study does provide some significant insight into what chief business officers, what financial aid directors, and vice presidents of enrollment management and other college leaders are focusing on to ensure that their institutions are here to carry out their missions and to make sure that their doors remain open for students in the future.
John, that's the end of our slides. I do want to just emphasize a point that Stefan made. One of the things that we have discovered with our annual results that institutions are looking more and more for ways to become more efficient and effective. And that has meant everything from cost containment to adjusting faculty size, to Stefan was mentioning introducing or expanding or attracting different academic programs. The name of the game, I think, as institutions struggle with this issue is looking for ways to become more efficient and effective, but at the same time trying to protect academic integrity and student services. Ultimately, the goal is help as many students as possible become successful. So if there's one sort of bottom line result of our survey, it's exactly that. And each institution will respond to that question differently. But we do know that that question is being asked more and more on campus as institutions and their leaders look to contain or control different investment. So with that, we'd be glad to turn it back over to you and take any questions or comments from the audience.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you, Stefan, for presenting and sharing that information with us. If you have a minute, please do feel free to write your questions in the chat, and Melissa Reed, my colleague at Ad Astra, will be monitoring that and sending them over to me. I've already received a few questions already, so I thank you for that. Before we get into the questions and answers, we have a minute, and I'd like to use that to come up with a couple ways that you can stay engaged in Astra Academy, as well as some of the activities that are going on with NACUBO moving forward. NACUBO, the link here is within the NACUBO tuition discounting this presentation, which you will all receive. On this slide, you will see that there is a hyperlink that you could click on once you receive the PDF of this, and it will take you to the website that has the NACUBO tuition discounting study. If you'd like to purchase the study or see if your institution has already purchased it, that resource will be available to you. And Ken, I understand that you actually have another webinar that's coming up very shortly. Is that correct?
Actually, we do. We have next week, May 29th at 1 Eastern Time. We have a live streamed webcast where we will have Stefan once again walking through the results of the study, but then we'll also have representatives from an institution, Marian University in Indiana, and a industry expert, Ben Kennedy from Kennedy and Company, commenting on the results and also talking about the strategies that campuses are using to balance revenue and expenses and rethink or reconsider their tuition discounting strategies. So anyone from this audience is certainly invited to participate in that webcast, and the link that John mentioned should also have directions on how to participate in that webcast.
Yes,
and,
I think.
I'm sorry, John. I was going to say one last thing. We also have a free podcast that I and another member of the NACUBO team recorded that talks about the study and implications for campuses. And that podcast is free and also available on the link that we provide.
Yeah, so be sure, audience, to check out the NACUBO tuition discounting study and learn a little bit more, as well as download that free podcast where I'm sure they cover different content that we did today, or have your institution sign up for the webcast with some industry experts as well. This is our final Astra Academy for this part of the year in the spring, but we will return in the fall with additional Astra Academy events. And then finally, I wanted to remind you all of Aspire 19, which is the Ad Astra Users Conference, which is in Kansas City, Missouri. If you are interested in attending, you can click that link and register as well. And the dates for that are October the 13th through the 16th. So without further ado, let's get into some of the questions. So I guess the first question is a good place to start because it comes from, I think, the first or second slide that Stefan shared with us. And the question says, at 50%, at what point does tuition discounting become unsustainable? So I think, Stefan, you on it a little bit in some of your final comments, but is there any concern perhaps that as we see it go up from year after year, that this might become perhaps, it says unsustainable maybe for an institution, but maybe a larger sector of higher education? You mentioned 314 small institutions. Is there additional pressure on those kind of CIC institutions and similar institutions in this rate of discounting becoming unsustainable?
Yeah, we get that. This is Ken. I think it's an appropriate question. It's one that we get and wrestle with ourselves all the time. So to kind of put this in context, remember that our current study right now, we're focused specifically on tuition revenue and financial aid spending. We know a number of campuses have tried to diversify their revenue sources. We don't ask them about auxiliaries, the libraries, bookstores, et cetera. We don't ask about athletic revenue and other types of revenue that institutions may generate as a substitute for tuition revenue and costs associated with those as well. But that's my way of saying that without knowing those other new or continuing revenue sources, answering the sustainability question is somewhat difficult. But we do know that one of the fastest rising costs for institutions is financial aid, as the discount trend demonstrates. The other thing that we know is that for these colleges, particularly the smaller private colleges, the plurality of their revenue as of now is tuition fees or net tuition fees. So while we don't have the full revenue picture, we're fairly certain that many of these schools will remain tuition dependent for quite a while. To the extent that this is sustainable, though, it really will depend on how institutions are strategy-wise, what efforts do they do to generate revenue from new sources and control costs, become more efficient. We don't, in the report, we don't say what the tipping point is because of the data that we have, but we are, and more importantly, our members are very concerned about controlling the financial aid budget and trying to find some more sustainable way of both pricing themselves and meeting campus goals without harming student access or services. So it's going to be a very difficult balance with that. But I think the key measure in our study, therefore, going forward will be not so much the discount rate, but that net tuition revenue number.
Sure.
Can institutions find a way to raise net revenue regardless of the price or the discount rate per se, but can they enroll enough students so that net revenue number is growing faster than the rate of inflation, which right now inflation is about 2% in the HEPI. So really 3% or north of that is really going to be the goal going forward. So we'll be monitoring that metric more closely in our office than even the discount rate, and we'll basically see how the next year or two how many schools are able to get to that 2 to 3% and higher net revenue number, and that will really tell us the story of whether the practices they have are sustainable and whether or not they can turn around that discount story that we're seeing right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question is actually maybe a combination of two questions, so I'll just frame it a little bit more generally, which is why don't more institutions do a tuition reset? And for those of you that might not know, a tuition reset might be if an institution is discounting at 50%, they get a lot closer to the actual rate at which the cost structure is for to educate a student at their institution. So to use like an analogy from car sales, that you take the sticker price and you drop it way down and say, this is essentially what you pay because this is roughly what it costs us to educate a student with a little bit of margin. So I guess broadly, why don't more institutions do a tuition reset if there's such large discounts?
Yeah, again, a very appropriate question. Just to give a little history, John, your explanation was exactly right. As you know, John, I'm sure other people in the audience know, the tuition resets, tuition freezes, rollbacks have a long history in private nonprofit higher education. The first sort of significant effort at this was undertaken by Muskegon College back in like the early to mid 90s, and they actually had some success with that. They had quite a bit of success with that. More recent years, a number of campuses have tried various forms of a reset, whether that be a freeze or an actual rollback or some combination thereof. As you can see on the one of the slides that Stefan talked about, just under a quarter of institutions within our study said that they have either implemented, changed, or planning to implement a tuition reset, tuition freeze, or what have you, some sort of different pricing strategy going forward. We think overall that that's an experiment that bears watching. The successful institutions that have done a reset have been able to sustain that, and they've been able to essentially to reframe the issue and ultimately control their financial aid costs. What has happened unsuccessfully in the past has been that an institution has reduced or frozen its tuition, and after a year or two, what they've discovered is that they've actually lost applicants and students because many of the people in their markets are so conditioned to a large financial aid award that they've ultimately decided that they'd rather have the large financial aid award rather than having the small, a relatively smaller financial aid award, but at a lower list sticker price. So each market is different, obviously. Each campus is different. Each story is different. The one thing I would caution, though, is that because each school is different, just taking one campus's effort at a tuition freeze may not necessarily work on another campus. It takes a lot of time and marketing and retraining and reframing the issues before a campus just simply cuts the tuition price. It has to be part of a larger strategy and has to be communicated consistently across the campus and across the community that that campus is hoping to serve. So I think in a lot of instances, campuses have introduced a tuition price reset, but not done the preliminary work to announce that reset in a strategy that rolls it out and gets the campus community used to what will be a pretty substantial change in their financial aid budget as a result of the reset. So again, I've said every campus is different, and every strategy has to be very carefully laid out. So I think that's because of that, because schools know that, that's why you're probably not seeing wholesale big changes in pricing strategies. I think it's going to take a while for the ones that campuses have started it to demonstrate long-term success before other schools begin to adopt some sort of a strategy like it. So that part of it, obviously, we don't know. But what we do know is that, as I said, just simply cutting the tuition price without a strategy around it has in the past not been successful. It's the schools like Muskegon and a few others that have done the resets that have really marketed it well, communicated about it well, and have been able to sustain it over a number of years in order to judge the success of those.
Okay, great. Thank you for that detailed answer, Ken. The next question is, do ISAs influence tuition discounting? So I think the question there is certainly income share agreements, which is a type of financing where the student would pay a portion of their tuition or after they graduate. And so I'm guessing the question is related to your benchmarking study. in terms of would the overall discount rate be influenced by it if an institution has adopted an income share agreement?
Good question. Since we don't ask that in our survey, I don't think we should respond. The other thing I will say is, John, as you described it accurately, ISAs really come into effect after a student has left school and presumably has found some job or gainful employment, and the terms of repayment, quote unquote, can be more firmly established, which obviously for tuition pricing and discounting strategy are things that a campus or a student even wouldn't know until they reach that point of graduation and hopefully, as I said, gainful employment. So what effect that would have on tuition pricing and expectations of discounting are probably somewhat minimal. But again, having said that, answering that with any kind of authority is not something that we can do, given that we don't really ask that in our survey.
Okay, great. Another question, I think this is probably coming from somebody who is a reader of Inside Higher Ed, which is always good to see. Holy Cross went need blind. They're no longer need blind.
That's correct. They are no longer need blind. That's right, John.
Yeah. Are there any other institutions that are still need blind? So maybe just generally talk about what need blind admissions would be and how that might influence tuition discount.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm sure people in the audience are familiar with the process of applying for admissions and financial aid. Admissions decisions and financial aid decisions are generally speaking, handled by two different departments, obviously on campus. But on many campuses, admissions decisions, while they're separate from financial aid decisions, are somewhat linked in that a campus will say, well, we'll admit this student, but we'll admit him or her knowing that they have some financial need and maybe not being able to meet that need. And that might affect how we admit the student and how we package financial aid for that student. Some campuses are need blind in admissions. In other words, that means that their admissions decisions and their financial aid decisions are completely blind or separate from each other. And then the campus, once they admit a student, will do everything that they can to meet the full need of that student. Usually it's large research universities that have some financial capacity through their endowment or some other resource that will say we can admit all students who meet our admissions criteria regardless of their financial need, and our financial aid department and other departments will do everything they can to meet the full need of that student. So that would be a completely need blind admissions process where 100% of the need is met for everybody who meets our admissions standards, admissions criteria. As you well imagine, as I said before, that usually that's large research universities, Harvard, Stanford, that can make that pledge to be need blind. The vast majority of campuses, while their admissions and financial aid decisions are separate, are what they call need sensitive, meaning that they'll admit students regardless of their financial need level, but they explicitly do not guarantee that they will meet 100% of the student's financial need. Holy Cross, as you mentioned, just announced not too long ago that they will no longer be need blind, they will be need sensitive. A relatively, it may not sound like a big change, but it actually is a big change because it means that they will intentionally admit students for whom they've not met 100% of the student's need. And the students will have to fill that need either through additional borrowing or additional employment or some other mechanism that in the past, the students who were admitted to that school did not have to find those additional resources. So it may seem like a small change, but for students who are potentially attending that school, it could be a substantial impact on their ability to enroll in or graduate from that particular institution. Without making comment on why they may have made that change, I will say that unless a campus has some pretty substantial resources through their endowment or through donors, remaining completely 100% need blind is a very, very difficult challenge as need for financial aid continues to rise and the revenue to fill that need is further and further constrained.
Sure, and I think you did talk about that. You and Stefan did talk about that earlier, with something like 89% of students actually receiving some aid. Another question.
That's right.
Very interesting one. I know that costs vary by discipline. Does aid vary by discipline? So I guess maybe does your study take into account maybe the disciplinary differences between a student intending on chemistry versus not? So right. I think I know the answer. That might be a quite quick one for you.
Yeah. So our survey is we don't look at differential tuition pricing strategies directly. So we really can't answer questions about differential tuition discounting strategies. The data that we show is sort of the average across campuses, both on the price side and the financial aid / discounting side. Having said that, one of the things that I think we may need to look more into in our study is differential tuition pricing strategies, as certainly more and more campuses are essentially, in very broad generalization, but essentially charging more tuition for engineering, chemistry, sciences, etc., since those tend to have higher costs through lab work and other technology needs that are different from liberal arts, humanities, those kinds of more non-laboratory based programs. So we can't answer the question directly, but we know that does happen a lot on many campuses, particularly those campuses that have big engineering or science type programs.
Okay, sounds good. There's another question from a researcher. I'm fairly certain I know who this is, but an excellent question, and it's directed at you, Ken. It says, ask Ken, since there are institutions that participate in the endowment study, if they also blend the data from the tuition discounting study to see what extent, if any, endowments might have on the rate at tuition discount.
Yes. We do have a fairly high number.
And before you get started, maybe you might
sure.
Here for those in the audience who might not know about your endowment study, what that is and what that involves.
Oh, yes. Thank you for that reminder, John. I appreciate that. So obviously NACUBO does the tuition discounting study. We also do a pretty extensive survey of college and university endowments. That survey goes to both public universities and private universities. We have about 800 institutions that respond to that study, and that's a blend, as I said, of public and private universities. On our website, there is a section on the study, on the NACUBO TIAA study of endowments, which is the official name of the study. TIAA is our sponsor of that study, and we definitely thank them for their support of that study. But we survey roughly 1,100 institutions, and we get responses. Last year, the number was 802 responses. 802 responses to that survey. And that survey asks about investment returns, asset allocation, investment policies, governance. It runs the gamut in terms of what we ask about. And that survey, we include every size category, going from schools like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, University of Chicago, down to small community colleges and small public and private institutions. Last year, as I said, there were 802 responses, and the median endowment of our respondents was about $140 million. So while the big universities obviously get a lot of attention in terms of their endowments, the typical campus has a relatively small to mid-sized endowment, which leads me to a link between endowments and tuition discounting. So a few years ago, we began to intentionally link our endowment study with our tuition discounting study. In fact, the first year for which we did that was the year, academic year 2010-2011. We actually started linking our endowment survey responses with our tuition discounting responses. So we know, as Stefan mentioned this before, we know based on that linkage that roughly 200 or so institutions that participate in the tuition discounting study also participate in the endowment study. And among those campuses, we found that about 11% or so of the dollars used for institutional grant aid come from endowments. And that varies from about a third at the large institutions to roughly 5% at the smallest institutions. We have not done this, but we certainly can calculate a discount rate among those 200 or so campuses that participate in both studies. In fact, that might be something, Stefan, that we might take on in a future study. But absolutely, we can begin, if the desire and the need were out there, of looking at the linkages between endowment and tuition discounting, discount rates, percentage of students who get funds for institutional grants. I'm going to guess that it won't be substantially different from what we show on the slides here, but it's something that we can look into doing more directly as time goes on. And as I said, we have roughly 5 to 6 years of data of this linkage, so we can actually, if we wanted to, we can actually put a little trend together comparing those two types of institutional responses.
Yeah, it sounds good, and it sounds like you have at least someone else that is interested in maybe that research being in the future.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
A couple other questions from our audience. When calculating discount rate, does this compare with and without external funding sources, such as looking at a discount rate without federal and state contributions, have internal versus external discount? And then is there more info on institutions that have an increased tuition rate, as in states that have budget issues, Illinois, and problems in funding education? I know that your study is largely private, but if you'd like to address the question related to federal and state contributions perhaps influencing tuition discounting.
Yeah, it's a fair question and fair point. For all those, our study, I have to admit, is silent. We don't go back and try to compare, contrast differences in internal, external sources of funding, other than endowments. As I said earlier, response, we do have a link with our endowment study. So by definition, that's some endowment funding that plays a part in our survey. But as far as state appropriations and things like that, we are silent. I have to take John, I think I have to take a pass on the questions. I think they're really good questions and certainly avenues for additional research. But we really, it goes beyond the scope of what we do right now. So I think I'm going to have to defer or take a pass on that question for now.
And thank you for the question. I can reach out to that audience member and maybe direct them to a prior Astor Academy with Robert Kelchin, who does research on tuition. And there's some good research on state appropriations and how state appropriations or the lack thereof might influence the financial position of an institution, which may or may not indirectly influence their tuition price, whether it's discounted or not. As Ken mentioned, the expert in this field in higher ed, that they are relatively silent. I think we have time for one more question, so I will leave this one. And I thank you all for your questions, and certainly for Ken and Stefan for your willingness to participate. And this one goes to, specifically it mentions US News, but I think we can generally talk about rankings. And the selectivity of an institution play a role, or what role does it play in tuition discounting? So I think the question is, maybe if you're concerned about the selectivity of your institution, that you want the largest applicant pool, certainly, how discounting might matter as it relates to admits versus enrollees, and how tuition discounting might play a role. If you're dropping or rising in the rankings, is there any research on that, either at NACUBO or generally, on what that might mean?
Yeah, excellent question, and it is much broader than just U.S. News. In the past, NACUBO did actually have a number of tables in our study that looked at admission selectivity and discount rates. The data don't change that much from year to year, so we decided a couple of years ago and also to lessen the burden on respondents, we decided to not include that level of inquiry. But in a way, as Stefan mentioned this before, we do, because we look at research universities versus comprehensive master's level universities and then small private colleges, that's sort of a proxy for selectivity, because we know that those research universities, generally speaking, admit 1 in 10 or fewer of their applicants, and the small private colleges, generally speaking, are much more moderate in terms of their admission selectivity, anywhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of their applicants being accepted. So that's sort of our proxy at this point for admission selectivity. So we know just from our prior research and what I just said, the proxies that we use, we know the discount rates are very much related to admission selectivity level. The more selective you are, generally speaking, the lower your discount rate will be. And that's really more due not so much to the selectivity level as it is to the resources that an institution has. Bigger endowments, likely speaking more diverse revenue sources, likely more alumni donations and those kinds of things plays a huge role in your discount strategy. And also going back to a previous question, we also know that the completely need-blind schools in our survey tend to be those really big, large research universities, and the need-aware or need-sensitive schools tend to be the smaller and mid-sized colleges. So again, not only is the discount practices related to admissions selectivity, but so is the admissions process, admissions criteria, and the ability of campuses to be need aware versus need blind, also very much related to discounting practices and selectivity levels. So they tend to really go hand in hand. So, John, I hope that answers the question.
Yes,
Feel
I think
free, these and other questions, feel free to share any of these and any other responses with us and have contact us. We'd be glad to expound on things that may not have been clear, or we can follow up with other people. And
sure.
I think we got some great suggestions for follow-up research as well. So
Great.
we can definitely follow up those as well.
I thank you, Ken, and I thank you, Stefan, for your willingness to participate in this Astor Academy, and I thank all of our audience for attending. We will send out the presentation, and that actually does include on the first slide Ken and Stefan's contacts. So if we weren't able to get to your question today, I do apologize, but feel free to reach out to them, and they will be available to speak with you. So with that, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. And thank you again, Ken and Stefan, for participating.
Thank you. We appreciate it.